Well, we continue our study on the story of God. And today I want to tell you a story. If I can get this thing to move forward, there we are. Let me tell you a story about a God who's both infinite and personal. Now, as we saw last week, there's an importance of aesthetics for Christians. And in so many ways, especially at this time in our history, it is important for us to look at every avenue possible to engage the culture around us. And the head-on, logical, debating approach, which we, by the way, as a brotherhood have excelled at over the past 200 years, it really is not working as well at this time. And there are reasons for that. First of all, we have a problem where our culture does not value logic. When I was in school, you were taught in elementary school sets, logic, and proof. Now, young people are not taught that at all in school. And in fact, even in college, a college student is likely to be completely unfamiliar with these concepts unless he or she has taken an advanced class in the philosophy department. It's just simply not being taught. And as a result, critical thinking is not a skill that is widely accessible in our culture. Beyond that, there has been, and this runs in tandem with it, the thought of postmodernism, that really truth doesn't exist, truth doesn't matter. But ultimately, very few people put forward really that there's no value, that there's no such thing as good and evil, it's right and wrong. Most people will say very flatly, there are things that are wrong and there are things that are right. And even those who in their armchair philosophy say they don't believe in absolutes, if you press them, you'll find something where they have an absolute value. They believe that something is worth more than something else. For that reason, aesthetics, a discussion of values, a discussion of an aesthetic appreciation, is often a good point to use in talking with people, especially for the purpose of our study this quarter, the idea of a story, of laying something out in a way that will resonate. Now, when we talk about aesthetics, one of my favorite authors on this is Edmund Burke. You probably know him better for his book, Reflections on the Revolution in France. He was a British statesman who was very prominent, actually the most vocal member of parliament who supported the American Revolution, but was very critical of the French Revolution. Well, before he did any political writing, he wrote a philosophical document, an inquiry into the beautiful and the sublime. Now, as we look at these concepts of the beautiful and the sublime, we're going to find within those two concepts literally everything that we would want to discuss in terms of a narrative, of a story. And I would go further and say all of aesthetics will rest on this. Whenever we talk about the sublime, we're talking about that which invokes awe. When people look at something that's artistic, sometimes the artistry is not something that you would think of as beautiful, but rather it is gripping. It engages you. In some ways, you think of it as invoking the idea of terror. And literally all great art in terms of stories, in terms of narratives, will have this kind of an element. Walt Disney pointed this out with his feature cartoon films. His first great blockbuster was Snow White. But in the telling of Snow White, what do you have? Well, you have a woman who is in a horrible situation, and there are evil things all around, personified by the wicked stepmother. And so there's the element of terror, which then leads to a dramatic understanding. Disney then pointed to his first big flop, which was Alice in Wonderland. And he said after it was over, well, nobody really cared about Alice. It was fanciful, but it was not dramatic. So it is that the elements of terror, of horror, of dread, and of mystery are all a part of what we think of as sublime. In other words, the word sublime just simply means that which causes you to pull back or pull down, that you are in awe of it. A philosopher in Germany, early 20th century, Rudolf Otto, popularized the term the numinous. C.S. Lewis, in his book, The Problem of Pain, uses this illustration to help people understand what numinous is. He said, in essence, if he were to tell you that in the next room there was a tiger, well, you would have a certain feeling. You would worry about that. But if he told you in the next room there's a ghost, and if you believed it, well, people have a certain feeling of being ill at ease with the idea of a ghost being in the next room. But it's not because of a danger of what the ghost is going to do to you. It's by its very nature, it's uncanny. It's outside of what you expect. It's the mystery of it. Now, in contrast to the sublime, we have the beautiful. The sublime, while it fascinates, it tends to make people want to keep some distance. Whereas the beautiful is attractive, it draws in. Whereas the sublime is dissettling, the beautiful is pleasing. And all aesthetics unfold with the sublime and the beautiful. As we think in terms of aesthetics, the very best resonate with both within us, and we can identify, at least in some way. So much of the problem with the more contemporary art is that it resonates with some people very much, but then others just look at it and they don't get it. By the way, I fit in that category. Some people look at a Jackson Pollock painting and they see great art. I just see some splatter, but that's a different matter. As we look at this and the discussion of God, the beautiful and the sublime enter into the problem of the infinite and the personal God. Very few people in history have been atheists. Now, they make a lot of noise in our culture, but even in our culture, in the United States, we're talking about 10% of the population. Overwhelmingly, people in our culture believe in a spiritual reality of some kind. And that percentage would go up even higher if you look worldwide and over time. It is just simply people have talked about God or the gods. But here's the difficulty. Do you look at God as sublime, as awesome, as infinite? And when you focus on God being infinite, there is a very real tendency that you will see in some of the Western philosophers, but even more so, almost universally in Eastern philosophers, to reduce God down to an infinite principle and to discuss him in ways of being impersonal. In fact, even beyond good and evil. The famous symbol of the Tao with the black and the white, um, the Tao itself is both of those, both good and evil. By the way, that was popularized, of course, in the Star Wars saga with the Force that was both good and evil. And there was no moral differentiation, really, when you got down to it. You think in terms of Buddhism or Hinduism, where the greatest ideal is to be absorbed into the void, to cease existing as an individual. And this is the idea of God being everything, pantheism. So that's the infinite. And you look at that, and that's very unsettling. But other religions focus on the personal. Basically, all the pagan mythologies. The gods of Greek and Roman mythology really were not different from human beings. They just had more power. They were very similar. In fact, it's not by accident that you have crossovers with the current comic book heroes and mythological heroes, because ultimately, when you talk about Zeus or Apollo or whomever, they're really just like human beings. They just have more power. And that's the problem of the personal being emphasized. And by the way, even all of the gods of mythology aren't really in control. No one of them is completely in control, and even all of them together are not in complete control, because in the Greek and Roman mythology, you've got the three fates hole up in a cave, and they spin out even the story of the gods' lives and cut them off. I mean, it doesn't have certitude. But for Christians, we find that the story of God tells us about a God who is infinite, a God who is sublime. Whenever we think about God being sublime, we think about him being eternal. He's not created. He's always been there and always will be there. The eternal nature of God is seen in Psalm 102. Beginning in verse 25, of old you laid the foundation of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you will remain. They will all wear out like a garment. You will change them like a robe, and they will pass away. But you are the same, and your years have no end. The idea that God is immutable, he doesn't change. He doesn't grow old. He doesn't get tired. He's not going to wear out like anything that we think of in the physical realm. And he's always been there. Somehow we are able to think in terms of eternity in one direction, because you can always think in terms of, well, not this year or the next year or the next year, but you can pick some number and think, well, we're still going. But to think of eternity in the other direction is something we can't really get our minds around, which is what makes it numinous. It makes it awesome. It makes it vast. but God has always been there, and God is awesome. He is awe-inspiring. It's unfortunate that the word awesome has been cheapened. You go to Dairy Queen, and someone ahead of you in line, you know, orders a hot fudge sundae, and it comes, and they look at it and they say, "That's awesome." We've used that word in such a way that all it means is some generic good. It's something I like. But the word really means awe-inspiring. By the way, we've done the same thing with the word terrific. Terrific means terror-inspiring, but we've changed that around. But God is awesome. He is someone whom we ought to fear. Proverbs 9, verse 10, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is insight. This same phrase, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, is repeated often in the wisdom literature of the Old Testament. And unfortunately, we look at this, and we do have to recognize that everything that we know about God, all of our dealings with God, is done through analogy. We can't really talk about God and know exactly what we're talking about because he's beyond us. But there is still truth in the analogy. Sometimes we spend so much time focused on what kind of fear this isn't that we don't deal with that it means fear. There is fear that is connected with this. You should have a feeling of disquietude contemplating God because he is awesome. Very practical point of this is made by Jesus. Matthew 10:28. Jesus says, "And do not fear those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Rather, fear him who can destroy both soul and body in hell." Now, Jesus tells us more about eternal punishment than anyone else in the Bible. And he does so very graphically, of the weeping, the wailing, the gnashing of teeth. And in this passage, he talks about the need to fear God. And it is not some abstraction. You fear God because the consequences of not being right with God are horrible. He can destroy body and soul in hell. The book of Isaiah tells us, Isaiah 8, beginning verse 12, do not call conspiracy all that this people calls conspiracy, and do not fear what they fear, nor be in dread. But the Lord of hosts, him you shall honor as holy. Let him be your fear, and let him be your dread. Now, we don't usually use the expression dreadful to describe God. But God, through Isaiah, uses that exact expression of himself. We look at God, and he invokes a sense of awe. We fear God. We have this sense of him being so different from us that he's uncanny, that he is someone that we aren't completely comfortable in approaching. You think about Moses. Moses maybe got a little bit too comfortable and said, well, God, I want to see your face. And God said, well, Moses, no one who sees my face can live. The idea of the awesomeness of God. God is awesome because he is the creator. We will be covering this more fully later in the story of God, the story of him as creator, but it tells you something about the God who is sublime. Jeremiah 5:22, God says, "Do you not fear me, declares the Lord? Do you not tremble before me? I placed the sand as the boundary for the sea, a perpetual barrier that it cannot pass. Though the waves toss, they cannot prevail. Though they roar, they cannot pass over it." God says through Jeremiah, just look at this world and look at the raw power that you see in the world. And for a coastal nation like Israel to look out on the sea and to see it churning, that would speak to them. And he said, you know what? I put the sea there. And I drew the line and I said, you stay there. And if I can do that, shouldn't you fear me? Shouldn't you tremble before me? What power do you have compared with the sea? God as creator is awesome. And God as judge. The idea that we all are going to give account before God. We'll be looking at this concept also later in our study. But it factors into the reality there is no court of appeal to God. It's always interesting. You read through various criminal trials, and there are many instances where someone gets off because of a loophole, or maybe it's the corruption of the judicial system. Somebody bribed the judge. Well, you're not going to bribe God. What are you going to give him? And furthermore, there's no loophole. To whom will you appeal if God hands down a judgment? He's it. The psalmist says, Psalm 119, 120, my flesh trembles for fear of you, and I am afraid of your judgments. God is infinite. He's sublime. But God is also beautiful. And this is where the God revealed in Scripture is radically different from the God of Eastern philosophy, the God of the great void, the great unknown. He's beautiful. Isaiah 33, verse 17, your eyes will behold the King in his beauty. They will see a land that stretches afar. By the way, this is a messianic prophecy. And it speaks in two ways. First of all, it does speak of that eternal kingdom to which we are going, described in the book of Revelation, the holy city, the New Jerusalem, where we will be with the Lord. And by the way, in that city, there's no temple because you can see God right there. Jesus will be right there. You will behold the King in his beauty. But this also is realized in part in the church. Everyone who is a Christian has, through the eyes of faith, seen Jesus, and they know he is beautiful. He is personal. Psalm 50, verse 2, out of Zion, the perfection of beauty, God shines forth. And we look at this, and this combination of the beauty speaks out even within the idea of the numinous. Ecclesiastes 3, verse 11. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. This is why the story of God always will resonate with people, because God has put eternity in the hearts of men and women. There is something that human beings just viscerally cannot accept, with the idea that when you die, everything's over. The most famous atheist towards the turn of the last century was Colonel Robert Ingersoll. He lectured all over the country on various discrepancies he thought he found in the Bible and why people needed to accept that there was no God. But then he had a family member, a young man who died. And Ingersoll, a great orator, was asked to speak at the funeral. And you read what he said, and it's tragic. Because what he laid out was essentially, there's no reason to believe, but we want to believe. Well, that longing, that eternity in the hearts of men and women is there. Further, we find that God is personal. Everything that you think of that adheres to being a person, you find in God. Every perfection is in God. And we see the personal nature of God in the Trinity. In subsequent lessons, we'll be looking at God the Son and God the Spirit. But this underscores that there was communication and love among the persons of the Trinity for all time. There's a famous jazz opera called God's Trombones, and it describes the creation. And in this work, it has God saying, I'm lonely. I think I'll make me a man. You know what? God didn't make Adam because he needed somebody to talk with. First of all, we have every reason to believe that the angelic host already existed by that time. We don't know that for sure. But you know what? God had somebody really worthwhile to talk with. I have a shirt that I like to wear. I wore it for the 20s retreat. It said, of course I talk to myself. Sometimes I need intelligent conversation. But you know, there are times you just need someone to talk with you, whether they are very sharp or not. I talk with my dogs all the time, and they answer me, but I don't know just what they're saying. But God always had someone who was worthy of his discussion. In John 17, we read this prayer from Jesus. Father, I desire that they also, whom you have given me, may be with me where I am, to see my glory that you have given me, because you loved me before the foundation of the world. So we go back before the creation, and God had love. God the Father and God the Son were there. Further, we learn, and we do not know as much about this person, but we learn of a spirit who is in communication. John 14:16, Jesus says, and I will ask the Father, and he will give you another helper to be with you forever. The Son asks the Father sends the Spirit. We have within the one God, three persons in perfect love and communication. And so we find a personal God. By the way, the doctrine of the Trinity answers the underlying philosophical question that has bedeviled philosophers through the ages of the one and the many. Is reality ultimately just one thing, or is it just lots of disconnected things? And the answer is there is one God who exists as three persons. And for that reason, we're able to understand a world where there is both unity and diversity. And we find the beauty of God, his personhood, seen with his people. In future lessons, we will be looking at God's relationship with his people and the way in which he relates to us and helps us to understand who he is. But we see in this great beauty. Psalm 27, verse 4. One thing I have asked of the Lord, that will I seek after, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord and to inquire in his temple. Now, we think in terms of David, and of course, David never saw the physical temple, but spiritually, he was in the house of the Lord. He was one of God's people, and he was in that spiritual temple of God's family, as we are in the Lord's church today. Zechariah 9:16 and 17. On that day, the Lord their God will save them as the flock of his people. For like the jewels of a crown, they shall shine on his land. For how great is his goodness and how great is his beauty. Grain shall make the young men flourish, and new wine the young women. On that day, the day of salvation, this is the day the Lord has made. We will rejoice and be glad in it. A day where we have engaged the beauty of God. In this way, we see the infinite and personal God, both together. Isaiah 57, verse 15, for thus says the one who is high and lifted up, who inhabits eternity, whose name is holy. I dwell in the high and holy place, and also with him who is of a contrite and lowly spirit, to revive the spirit of the lowly, and to revive the heart of the contrite. God is not only out there, he's here with us. He is in the heart of his people. Again from Isaiah 66, verse 2. All these things my hand has made, so all these things came to be, declares the Lord. But this is the one to whom I will look, he who is humble and contrite in spirit and trembles at my word. So God says, yes, I'm the creator. I've made all this stuff. But the one who humbles himself before me is the one that I will be with, that I will enter into a personal relationship with. And so we find the story of God as a God who is infinite, but also a God who is personal. Hebrews 12, picking up in verse 28. Therefore, let us be grateful for receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken. And thus let us offer to God acceptable worship with reverence and awe, for our God is a consuming fire. Now notice the author of Hebrews says that all of this, the awesomeness of God, is something that should lead us to be grateful. Why? Because that God who cannot change has brought us into a kingdom that can't be shaken, that can't be destroyed. And so we share in the blessings of his infinite nature. But as we approach him, we need to worship him acceptably. And acceptable worship has as its hallmark reverence and awe. Why? Because our God is a consuming fire. That's the way it was, and that's the way it is with the story of God. An eternal story of God who is both infinite, but he is personal, who is sublime and awesome, but beautiful, and a God who has reached out to us and in his grace has permitted us to come to him. We'll be picking up there next week with the story of God and the epic narrative. Thank you very much.